Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and we are on the official first episode of our expose into the book, The Bell Curve, by Richard J. Herrnstein and Dr. Charles Murray. For this episode, we're going to be going through the introduction, so just pages 1 through 24. There was even some stuff before the introduction. There was some acknowledgments, a preface, but I thought, you know what, let's just dive right into it. I know we did the same thing for Man's Search for Meaning. We did the preface and the foreword, introduction, and I just thought, you know what, let's just do the introduction. Because this is going to lay out pretty much what we're going to expect out of this book. If you guys got this book, ordered it, got it from your library, if your libraries are open, reading it online, wherever, borrowed it from a friend. I actually bought this book from a used book sale 4 years ago, something like that. And wherever you got it. This book's a big book. It's 500 plus pages. There's appendices, source notes. There's a section on statistics that I was kind of trying to read a little bit too. It's been a while since I've done stuff with statistics, but this book's going to be a journey. So I'm going to do my best to kind of go through it slowly, try to be as detailed as possible, but recognize that nothing's going to really replace the author's words. I'm going to try to do my best job, but along the way, if you have questions, just throw them in the comments. Let me know. And let's get started. Heterodox Views. The first slide here. And why do I use that term heterodox? Well, that's kind of what the authors use to describe their views on intelligence. So we start off with some definitions here the authors do. The ability to learn or understand or to deal with new or trying situations. Intelligence. The ability to apply knowledge to manipulate one's environment or to think abstractly as measured by objective criteria such as tests. Another definition for intelligence. And I believe I got these just from Merriam-Webster online dictionary. Because also I have on the slide here IQ. So IQ is the score of intelligence that's determined by one's performance on a standardized intelligence test. And that's going to be compared to the average performance of others at the same age. That's where this mental age is calculated, right? So you could score really high and be above your mental age. So another definition of IQ, the ratio of mental age to the chronological age multiplied by 100. I remember hearing back when I was in college, taking psychology, whatnot, the average intelligence was 100, I think. That was like average. I don't know if that was for America, for the world, but that was always considered like the median or the mean. And there's a difference between those two words. Let's continue on. So the authors, Charles and Richard, make one assertion, and they assert that intelligence is well understood. It can be measured, and it paints a pretty good picture of success in a person's life, the type of job that they could qualify for, the college that they could get into. We're able to kind of infer some things from somebody's intelligence or from a group's intelligence, because when you get down, we're going to see here reading the book, when you get down to just like one specific individual can stray from these kind of boxes. I don't even want to say boxes, but they can stray off the line a little bit. Somebody could have a lower IQ, right? Not a super intelligent, not necessarily lower, but not a super intelligent IQ, or not be like a super intelligent person, yet still be successful in their life. And I don't think the authors are going for that. The studies in this book that are going to be presented, their theories, are not specific to one person, but it's averages across groups. And then this is where we'll have to get into like standard deviations and what those mean. It's hard to say something about one specific person, but about a group, things can be inferred from that group, from studies done on groups of people and their intelligence at different walks of life, at different ages. So that's what the authors are saying here. Whoops, let me go back. That we actually know quite a bit about intelligence, and it's been kind of thought about, mulled over for a long time, since Darwin. I mean, even Darwin asserted that intelligence was inherited. It was a key part of human evolution. This is how we got from apes to Homo sapiens, where we are today, if you believe in such theories. I'm not going to convince you or anything like that. Sir Francis Galton built off of Darwin's theories, and he did some studies on the royal family, and I think Galton was British English too. And he was saying how in the royal families, intellectual capacity was kind of passed down through the families. And they differed compared to all like the common folk in England. And I'm pretty sure Sir Francis Galton was English, from England. So there was already this kind of thought about how intelligence is heritable, it's passed on, people are different when it comes to their mental strengths and their weaknesses. This stuff is nothing new. So Sir Francis Galton was like kind of one of the first people that attempted to devise tests of intelligence. And he made these tests kind of based on sensitivity of perceptions. The 5 senses that we have. And actually there's way more. There's research that we have way more than 5 senses, of course. Hearing, sight, touch, taste. What's another one? Proprioception. Well, proprioception is another one, but we have a lot of these senses. And I'm assuming Galton here probably only tested for the ones that were pretty much universally known: sight, hearing, touch. So these were the first kinds of tests, testing for sensitivity of perceptions. Alfred Binet, I believe a French scientist, he was a scientist, I believe he was French. He picked up where Galton had left off, and he made intelligence tests based on something different than these senses. He made them based on ability to reason, draw analogies, identify patterns. So he made them a little bit differently, a little bit closer to what we would consider an IQ test in today's terms. Charles Spearman was the one that made the real breakthrough when it came to all of this. And he was able to make it because of the discovery of a correlation coefficient, which was first developed by Sir Francis Galton. This is all on page 2. We're going into like page 3 now, by the way. So it says here in the book, before the correlation coefficient was available, scientists could observe that two variables such as height and weight seemed to vary together. The taller, the heavier, by and large. But they had no way of saying exactly how much they were related. So this is where R comes in. That's the correlation coefficient. So things are there's a direct relationship between people, or there's a indirect relationship between people. So the closer you are to 1 or -1, the stronger that relationship is. Further away from 1, there's not really much of a relationship. So the -1 is like there's a negative direct relationship, like two variables both decrease with each other, or two variables increase while one variable increases, the other increases, or while one variable decreases, the other decreases. If you had one variable increase, the other decrease, okay, that's not a direct relationship. That's your correlation coefficient is going to be not as close to 1. So Spearman's Breakthrough, page 3. Spearman discovered something that by way of probably administering lots and lots of tests, trying to repeat studies, repeating tests, which is what I believe the scientific method is all about. You make a hypothesis, you test it. You're supposed to repeat it to see if it's valid, to verify it, to see if there's a consistency of results, right? So what he found out was people who did poor or good on one test tended to do poor or good on other tests. Interesting. And it did not depend on the content of the tests. And individual items within the tests showed positive correlations as well. So what I'm thinking happened here is, think about like an ACT or an SAT, the different like subjects within the test, right? Take me, for example. I think when I took the ACT, and I took it many times, I scored poorly on the reading section every time, or poorly compared to the other sections of the test. And those results were consistent among the, like the 5-6 times that I took it, if not more. I remember I always struggled with the reading. So there you see a consistency across the tests. Yeah, that was not a very strong section for me. And let me see here in the book again. This was page 3. It turned out to be nearly impossible to devise items that plausibly measured some cognitive skill and were not positively correlated with other items that plausibly measured some cognitive skill. However disparate the pair of skills might appear to be. Okay, so let's continue here. Positive correlations throughout the correlation matrix, but of varying magnitudes, inspired Spearman's insight. Why are almost all the correlations positive? Because they're tapping into the same general trait. You administer all these tests, and the same people are having similar results from test to test. And Spearman had thought of this unitary mental factor that was kind of governing all this, G, or general intelligence. G was kind of the overall mental capacity. Everything stemmed from G, for, at least the way that I kind of interpret what they mean by G. G, from almost any such collection, Spearman's method uncovered evidence for a unitary mental factor. Yeah. This, and I write here, one of my points here, this was different than the understanding of intelligence at the time. So what people understood about intelligence at the time was that it was your ability to learn and generalize what is learned. But as we're going to discover, it's much more than that. This is kind of what Spearman says. This is on page 4, guys. He hypothesized that G is a general capacity for inferring and applying relationships. Okay, that's what I had here on my slide. Let's continue on. This definition of intelligence differed subtly from the more prevalent idea that intelligence is the ability to learn and generalize what is learned. The course of learning is affected by intelligence in Spearman's view, but it was not the thing in and of itself. So there's something behind the scenes that is causing you to have this mental process, mental computer power behind the scenes. That's kind of how I interpreted what Charles and Richard were saying by this. Let's continue on. We get IQ. This term of IQ that's birthed through kind of the military. Already by 1917, soon after the concept of IQ was first defined, the U.S. Army was administering intelligence tests to classify and assign recruits for World War I. Within a few years later, the letters IQ had entered the American vernacular. As I think you kind of find in American history, military drives, I think, a lot of innovation. Think about World War II and the atomic bombs. Think about Vietnam, Agent Orange. Think about Gulf War. I think that's where they first introduced GPS was in there. And then usually what happens is the military has it first, and then it spreads out to the general public. At least the way that I see it. I'm only giving anecdotal evidence here. But in the case of IQ, this seems to hold true as well. The Army was first testing for it. They need people who are smart, bright, not only the toughest of the tough, but they want people who are going to be smart enough to follow out directives. So they start testing recruits for this. And they probably do the same thing today. Here's where we start entering in some controversy, which I'm sure we're going to see a lot of this controversy throughout this book, or what some people would label as controversial opinions. And just be ready for them and be open to them. I mean, let's not dismiss anything. I mean, let's just go through them. If you disagree, say why you disagree and whatnot. I'm going to try to be objective as best I can throughout our journey through this book. So, enter public controversy. Page 5. Now that IQ has started to be pervasive throughout American culture, it's not just in the military. Well, now you get people that are very focused on IQ, very focused on intelligence. They want to keep the American population pretty high IQ. It'd probably serve the nation best to have smart people. So you got some bureaucrats, I think, some people high up, advocating for some sterilization laws. This is between 1907 and 1917. 16 states, sterilization laws were passed. There was an objective to get rid of mental retardation. That was one of the public policies, and a quote here from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And then what do we have here? 1920s, House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization appointed an expert eugenical agent for his committee's work. A biologist who was especially concerned about keeping up the American level of intelligence. So it seems like, and if you read here, I have this link here, Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, which, if I click here, I think this will take me to it, hopefully. And hopefully it doesn't open up Edge. But this act, Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, is referenced in the book. Gosh, where was it? Here we go. Fact and Fiction about Immigration and Intelligence Testing. Immigration Act of 1924, which did indeed tip the flow of immigrants toward the Western and Northern Europeans. The difficulty with making the causal cases that a close reading of the hearings for the bill shows no such evidence that Brigham's book in particular or IQ tests in general played any role. So he's talking about this author, this guy Brigham. And where was this guy Brigham used? First is based on work done at Ellis Island by H.H. Goddard, who explicitly pre-selected his sample for evidence of low intelligence. Okay, I think they're talking about some of the biases that were placed on immigrants first entering the country, and they're kind of trying to dispel some myths here. 2 stories. One of them being, the first story is that Jews and other immigrant groups were thought to be below average. The other is that IQ tests were used as the basis for racist immigration policies of the 1920s. So, okay. So they're saying there's really kind of no evidence that IQ tests were used to discriminate based on that. And did this open up? Oh, yes, it did. Let's go over here. Cyril Burt. We're going to get to this guy in a little bit. I hope you guys can see that. So this is the Immigration Act of 1924, Johnson-Reed Act. Limited a number of immigrants, allowed entry into the United States through national origins quota, signed by President Calvin Coolidge. Quota provided immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States. As of the 1890 National Census, it completely excluded immigrants from Asia. So the 1917 Act implemented a literary test that required immigrants over 16 years old to demonstrate basic reading comprehension in any language. Okay. Okay, so maybe there was some sort of test, maybe not in 1924, but 1917 there was, and they were only allowing a certain number of people from these countries into the United States. Available each year to new immigrants. This put the total number of visas available each year to new immigrants at 350,000. So there's people who are thinking about this. They want to keep the population, and a high IQ. They don't want just anybody coming into the country, is what the authors are kind of saying here. So already IQ is kind of being seen as putting people in a position of superiority and inferiority. And IQ had like a cachet to it during kind of these times. IQ had, if you had a high IQ, you were seen as smart, trustworthy. You were probably had access to better education, a job. Although in these early days, we're going to see in the next chapter, wasn't always the case that the smartest people were in these jobs of, these kind of like white collar, professional positions that we view as very, you have to be intelligent to do these positions today. We're going to see this in the next chapter, so I'll kind of save it for that. But you're starting to be judged on all of this. So let's hop over to page 7. Attacks on testing fade. Page 7. Intelligence varies, but had little bearing on public policy. So what kind of happened is, this is where Walter Lippmann comes in, is they're already, like as I was saying the last slide, is people are starting to become vocal about it. 1920s, 1922, 23, Walter Lippmann is kind of fearing that intelligence testers are going to, people who score high on intelligence tests are going to occupy positions of power. So they're kind of fearing this, that it's going to be used against people. They're saying, how dare you? How can you judge a man from just a simple test when you haven't even like met him or talked to him before? How can you just judge somebody on a test, a scantron, basically? And they continue on here. 1930s, the tests start to improve. And for a while, the tests are starting to kind of gain popularity a little bit until the 1960s. This is when culture really started to change in America. You had civil rights. You had the war on poverty. You had Great Society. Things just started to shift. And you had a lot of people trying to change things. They were thinking that you could change intelligence. You could raise people's intelligence from government intervention or the correct public policy. Or that just changing your behavior could shift your intelligence. And then I wrote here, final point, egalitarianism versus intelligence as heritable. So kind of like a nature versus nurture argument, or like your environment determines your intelligence, not your heritability of it. So basically the point of that slide was, at one point, IQ was embraced. And then at another point, it was being attacked. And people saying that it didn't really measure much. It's not accurate. They're biased. It's racist. These tests. Let's go to page 9 because we get introduced to this guy, Arthur Jensen. Let me see. In 1969, Arthur Jensen, educational psychologist, expert on testing from the UC Berkeley, put a match to this volatile mix of science and ideology with an article in the Harvard Educational Review. So the HER, Harvard Educational Review, asked him to consider why compensatory and remedial educational programs begun with such high hopes during the War on Poverty, but yielded such disappointing results. And Jensen said something kind of controversial, concluded that the programs were bound to have little success because they were aimed at populations of youngsters with relatively low IQs. Very interesting. The article continued, disclosed that the youngsters in the targeted population were disproportionately black and that historically, blacks as a population had exhibited average IQ substantially below those of whites. Very, very interesting. And again, you can't paint a broad brush. This isn't everybody in this demographic group. You know, there's going to be individuals who succeed, who are better than others, who are not as good as others. But again, to harken back to what we went over in an earlier slide, in general, it has a good general idea. Intelligence is a good general. We can measure intelligence and predict certain things with relative accuracy for a group, a demographic, but it's not going to say anything about one specific individual. Enter more of this kind of like, I don't know what you would call this, not eugenics, but maybe eugenics, like William Shockley saying that, hey, we need to preserve, you know, our geniuses and the lineage of geniuses. We need sperm banks for them. We need to sterilize people with lower IQ. I think I've heard Charles Murray in an interview say how actually people with higher IQs tend to have less children. I believe I've heard him say in an interview before. And there's a famous, in the beginning of the movie Idiocracy, we actually see this. We see a working class kind of guy, I would maybe say it. You know, jock type character, and he's knocking up all these women, and then we see two pretty like professional, seemingly high IQ individuals, and they're like they don't even have a kid. They're not able to have kids. They're trying to have kids, and then they find out they can't have kids, and it's kind of this dichotomy between the two. And of course, the movie Idiocracy, it's a pretty funny movie. Eventually the Earth is populated. The Earth's IQ just completely just tumbles down. But anyway, let's get back to this book. So William Shockley advocating for some public policy to preserve the IQ of the nation. But then you have public policy kind of start to swing. You remember how we were talking about IQ tests once accepted. Now in the 60s, they're swinging the other way with all this, the shift in culture, civil rights, etc. You have this Supreme Court case, Griggs versus the Duke Power Company. 1971, U.S. Supreme Court outlawed the use of standardized ability tests by employers unless they had a manifest relationship to the specific job in question. So things were starting to tip the other way. You know, you can't use these tests, especially if it's unless you had a manifest relationship to the specific job in question. And that was in 1971. There was this guy, Cyril Burt, who I have. Yes, this gentleman, Cyril Burt. He was a scientist, a PhD, I think, doctor. What do we have here? Cyril Burt, scientist, British educational psychologist. Okay, so doctor, I'm assuming. Cyril Burt had some interesting studies. This kind of harkens back to the hereditary aspect of intelligence. He had twin studies where twins were reared apart. So you take a twins and you raise one over here, you raise the other one apart from that one, from its brother or sister. And what he found was the twins actually have similar intelligences as measured from intelligence tests. So their environments didn't really change their IQ much, if at all. And this website, Intel Theory, if you guys see it here on my screen, inteltheory.com/burt.shtml. And if you do, I remember I did a control find for twin. There we go. Between 1943 and 1966, he published a series of articles on identical twins raised in different homes. Each set of twins' intelligence test scores were extremely similar. He was kind of, his results were hotly contested. A lot of people were critical of his studies, saying that, he kind of forged data. Raw data supporting his results had either disappeared, never existed, inconsistencies. And the authors, Charles and Richard, let me go back to the slides, kind of write that he was kind of proven right on page 12. An ironic afterward centers on Burt's claim that the correlation between IQs of identical twins reared apart is positive 0.77, relatively strong. And then they reproduced his study in 1990, the Minnesota Twin Study, accepted by most scholars as a model of its kind, produced most detailed estimates of correlation of IQ between identical twins reared apart, and they found the procedure that most closely paralleled Burt's yielded a correlation of positive 0.78. So reproducing it in 1990, I get it, it's 30 years ago, but you got to remember this book was written in 1994, I think, 95, 94. So it's reproducible. They found the same thing. Definitely seemingly pointing to a heritability of intelligence. On to the next portion here, the three factions of intelligence. And I want you guys to kind of think about where the authors are on this spectrum. So Charles and Richard talk about there's three factions of intelligence in this field of work. There's the classicists, who kind of build off of Charles Spearman, Sir Francis Galton. They think that G is at the core of what intelligence is, that mental unitary factor, the factory, how would you call this, where all other mental abilities stem from in the mind. Yeah, I think that's how I would say it. Yeah, that's what G is, generalized intelligence. And they also say that intelligence tests generally do a good job. They're not biased if administered properly. And again, you can infer some things about a demographic from that demographics intelligence test, but not necessarily about a specific person in there. Then there's these revisionists, and they think that the theory of intelligence need not be structural. And it's focused on process over the end result. So the way you go about trying to solve a problem versus the end result versus your IQ score at the very end. Are you getting better over time? That's where Piaget's stages of cognitive development come in. Your intelligence changes over time. You get smarter over time, right? If you keep working at something, you'll make it better. And this is, where was this? Page 17, Sternberg's Triarchy of Human Information Processing. So the first part being internal architecture of intellectual functioning, the second part being routinizing performance, and the third part being intelligence in the real world in which people function. Oh, and I have it right down there. So what's, I think, Sternberg's triarchy here is exemplifying is you use what you have and it becomes routine, and then you utilize that, you fit that to the mold in which you live in the real world. Right? So if you're a factory worker, you're going to do what's necessary to be the factory worker, and it's not going to be the same thing as a lawyer. But if you do move towards the lawyer route, well, then you're going to develop a routinizing performance. You're going to develop processes to adjust to that new setting. That's what the revisionists are. Then there's radicals. Like we had mentioned, Walter Lippmann. Intelligence means more than being able to answer test questions. Not everybody's a good test taker. I remember I always used to say this. I do terrible on the ACT, SAT. I'm not a good test taker, right? And Howard Gardner comes around with the theory on multiple intelligences. So there's intelligence, there's in art, there's intelligence in athletics, there's intelligence in, hard sciences and architecture and mathematics is probably hard science, but public speaking, like interpersonal communication intelligence. But the authors point out that Howard Gardner didn't really have any hardcore data on this. It was mostly anecdotal, no psychometric or quantitative data, and he lists that, 7 distinct intelligences and a complete disregard of G, that general factor. And the authors kind of say, why are we labeling things as intelligent when really they probably should be labeled talents, or abilities, right? And let's not label intelligence for something that it's not. And sorry, I have the answer here, guys. The authors draw most heavily from the classical approach, which you could kind of tell just from going through these opening pages together that they would most heavily draw on that classical approach, that, there is this general factor, and tests are fairly reliable at showing a person's IQ level. So the authors ask 2 questions, and this is on right around page 19. It's kind of what I've asked before. Given 2 11-year-olds, one with an IQ of 110, one with an IQ of 90, what can you tell us about the differences between those 2 children? And the authors say, well, you can't really tell much. Again, from the first page, from one of our first slides, individually specific to one individual, you're not going to be able to infer a whole lot. Here comes the second question. Given 2 6th grade classes, one for which the average IQ is 110 and the other is 90, what can you tell us about the difference between those 2 classes and their average prospects for the future? And again, I say here with a typo on about one particular person, not much. But average outcomes, you can tell something. And that's what we're going to see, especially in the first chapter here. We're going to start to see how this is relating to groups of people, demographics, etc. pertaining to the radical view of intelligence here, the authors place some reservations about using intelligence in place of ability, so musical ability, athleticism. Gardner talks about, these are intelligence. This is intelligence, that you're very athletic, that you're musically like a Mozart or Beethoven. And the authors just ask, what's gained here by substituting talent in these areas with intelligence? Right? How does that change anything? And what they're saying is, they're basically talents. They don't really measure up to the definitions that we had of intelligence that we talked about on that very first slide, Heterodox Views. When somebody says somebody is smart, bright, that's what we mean by intelligence. Just because somebody can play the piano or is super athletic, we don't think of smart or bright to necessarily, maybe in music, but I haven't really heard that with athleticism. I mean, I have heard of people with like a high football IQ, like smart football players, they do smart plays. I've heard of that before. But in general, when you say somebody is smart, right, that's what you think of when you're thinking of somebody with high IQ. And again, this gets into a gray area with people can be street smart, like savvy, like good with people, just have a knack for business. But what the authors are saying, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a high IQ. So on page 21, all of this is in another way of making a point so important that we will italicize it now and repeat elsewhere. It's kind of like the main point of this book. Measures of intelligence have reliable statistical relationships with important social phenomena, but they are limited tool for deciding what to make of any given individual. This is what I've been trying to hammer down throughout this whole first episode, guys. Individually, it's hard, but as a demographic and a group, you can start to make some claims. Like I was saying earlier, there's not a real correlation between intelligence and certain abilities or qualities. And intelligence can be known to mean what we would call smart. And by the way, there's a lot of smart people who are probably out of work, who don't do well with other people, are very introverted, or can't talk, trip over their shoes. It's not synonymous with human excellence or making a lot of money, right? So just to lay that point out there. And we're going to end with this slide. The 6 conclusions on cognitive ability based on the classical tradition that can be backed up, and the authors mention this in the pages, that can be backed up with data that are tough to dispute. All right, and this is what Charles and Richard claim here. The general factor of intelligence exists. Actually, let me go to that page. I'm sorry, guys. It was close to the end of the introduction on page 22, if you all are following along. So number 1, general factor exists. Number 2, IQ tests are the thing that measure G the most accurately. Number 3, IQ scores match to a first degree whatever it is that people mean when they use the word intelligent or smart in an ordinary language. 4, IQ scores are stable, although not perfectly, over much of a person's life. Properly administered IQ tests are not demonstrably biased against social, economic, ethnic, or racial groups. Cognitive ability is substantially heritable, apparently no less than 40% and no more than 80%. This is what the authors are working off of here. And as we're going to see, because I've already read the first 2 chapters, and they are pretty interesting. This is what we are going to see throughout the book. Kind of data that backs up these 6 points. Just based on what I read from the first 2 chapters. I'm going to venture to guess that they're going to present information that hits at all of these major points here. Let me tell you, it's going to be a fun ride. I'm going to have to get pictures of some of these slides up, pictures of some of these graphs, because this is just the introduction. Things are we're just getting warmed up. But chapter 2, 3, lots of graphs. I'm going to have to find a way to get these up in the PowerPoint. Probably have to take a picture on my phone and send it, just so I can give you guys a visual. But we're going to end it there. That is the end of the introduction. 51, almost 52 minutes in, guys. It's one of the longer ones. If you listened with me, if you were here with me to the end, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. Leave any questions or comments in the discussion, or questions, or I was going to say answers. Yeah, questions or comments in the comments section. And thank you very much. For next time, in 2 weeks, we will read, we'll go over chapter 1. So that will be the weekend of the 22nd, January 22nd, 2021. We will go over chapter 1. Thank you guys for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash, and until next time, bye.